Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this mushroom house. Before I started sketching, I looked for inspiration on Pinterest just to see different shapes of doors and windows and things like that for inspiration. And then I just made my own version. Like usual, I like to start by sketching the main form of the subject very loosely to help me visualize what the size of the subject should be and how I would center it in the middle of my page. I want my mushroom house to be cute and plump, and I want the mushroom roof to be kind of fluid and bendy so it has more character. I also made frilly gills for the top as something like an awning. Once I'm happy with the size of the mushroom house, I'm also going to add other features like the windows and the doors. Then I start to sketch out the surrounding area to help frame the house. I added smaller mushrooms on the left side and a large fern on the left, so the house looks small in comparison to the surrounding plants. This also extends the composition higher since there's still a bit of space on top of the house. For a bit of extra color, I decided to add some blueberry plants on the right hand side, but you can also add red berries instead if you want. And I'm also going to add more ferns, which are at its early stages of growth, so they're curling inwards. I feel like I needed to extend the composition a little bit higher, so I also added blueberry plants on top of the house, which might be growing from the back. Once I have all the elements down, I'm going to start adding on the details of the house. I want the door to have tiny stones as a frame, so I just drew out circles in different sizes. I'm also going to fix the window frames, and meanwhile I try to simultaneously clean out my outline section by section as I add on the details. To draw the window frames, it helps to create a frame around the outside by doubling the line, then add the divisions. I just made 4 here, then I just erase the overlapping lines. For the spots, I made mine kind of lumpy like the real fly agaric mushrooms, so I made the blobs in different sizes and I made the blobs closer together on top with less blobs around the bottom as it disperses out. Personally, I want the smaller mushrooms to be portobello mushrooms, so I'm not going to draw on the scales and just leave them blank. Just one final touch up for the wooden doors, and since I'm happy with the outline, I'm going to start by masking the white spots and the window frames to make the painting process quicker later. But of course, this is optional. You can also paint around. In fact, I ended up making the window frames darker, so you can actually just paint over it without masking at all. While we wait for the masking fluid to dry, let's go over the colors. Firstly, this is Vermilion by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Prussian Blue by Holbein, and Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein. I'm also going to use Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. For the outlines, I'm going to use my Derwent Light Fast colored pencils in the colors Natural Brown and Chocolate, but you can use any colored pencils you have on hand. You can also use a brown pen or a black pen. And in case you're wondering, this is the masking fluid that I used by Maurice. Now let's begin to paint. I'm going to start by painting the light brown on the porcini mushroom, and I used a mix of buff titanium with a bit of burnt umber, Prussian blue, and permanent yellow deep. I'm just going to place this at the bottom of the mushrooms. Then for the top, I used a mix of permanent yellow deep, vermilion, and burnt umber. I'm painting this all in a medium to thick consistency, and right at the very top, while the surface is still damp, I follow it up with a dark brown from a mix of burnt umber, Prussian blue, and vermilion. While I'm painting, I like to direct the paint or the strokes following the curvature of the mushroom cap, so if I leave out some white space, it will follow the curvature and enhance the form, and it'll also look slightly textured. After this, I'm going to paint behind the mushrooms. I'm going to paint a background for the fern since I know there's going to be a lot of white showing through, but I want to fill the gaps up beforehand. And for the color, I'm using a mix of permanent yellow deep, Prussian blue, a little bit of burnt umber to mute it down, and buff titanium to lighten it. I'm going to paint random circles instead of doing a bushy sort of texture because I want the background to be fairly clean. Once I'm done, I'm going to leave it to dry and move on to the windows. And for this, I'm using a mix of permanent yellow deep and buff titanium in a medium consistency so it looks like there's light shining through the inside of the house. For the gills underneath the mushroom cap, I'm using the same light brown as what I use for the bottom of the portobello mushrooms. I'm also going to use the same color for the exterior of the main house, or basically the stem of this mushroom. For the exterior though, I start with a lighter consistency and I use a slightly thicker consistency at the bottom, close to the small mushrooms and underneath the frilly ring of the mushroom. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to go back to the color of the window and just paint all around it so it looks like there's a slight glow. Still working on the damp surface, I'm going to use burnt umber that I mixed into the orangey brown that I've pre-mixed. This is for some shadows underneath the ring of the mushroom, and after painting this I felt like the color was a little bit too vibrant, so I decided to mute it down by adding a touch of Prussian blue. I'm also going to use the same color to paint underneath the gills of the mushroom on the ring so we can separate the layers. As for the rest of the ring, I'm going to use the same color as the exterior before. Now to give the ring a little bit more form, I'm going to take some of the darker brown that I pre-mixed at the top of my palette and mix it with the creamy color from the base so I have a shade that is in between, and I'm placing this on the frills which are somewhat deeper or going downwards. Then with a thicker consistency of the dark brown, I use the tip of my brush with a dry brush load to paint on a little bit of line texture. Moving on to the base color of the stones for the door frame, I'm going to use a mix of Prussian blue, burnt umber, and buff titanium in a light consistency. I'm just going to paint it all over as a big silhouette instead of one by one, and I also want to use this color for the stairs underneath the door. For the door, you can choose any hue that you want, but I want mine to be this really deep green. And as for the mixture, I used Prussian blue, a little bit of permanent yellow deep, and some burnt umber to mute the color slightly. Next, I'm going to paint the mushroom cap or the roof of the house, and I'm going to use a very thick consistency of vermilion with burnt umber, and I'm going to start with the top. Before continuing down, I'm going to take some permanent yellow deep and paint it around the window so it looks like there's a slight glowing effect. Then as I get towards the outer parts of the window, I just added more vermilion. As I get towards the bottom, I want the color to be lighter, so I used a mix of vermilion with permanent yellow deep and buff titanium. As I progress through the different color mixtures, I'm not going to wait for each part to dry. In fact, I want to continue with the wet paint, so there's a natural gradation between those colors. Now going back to the door, once it's completely dry, I'm going to use the same green mixture and I'm going to place it underneath some of the stones, especially at the top for a little bit of cast shadow. I'm also going to use a thick consistency of this green to paint the vertical lines for the wooden planks of this door. And don't forget to create the same glowing effect. I just use permanent yellow deep again, this time on a dry surface, and I try to soften the edges using a clean damp brush. Now going back to the dark green again, I'm using a light to medium consistency and a dry brush load to paint vertically following the slight curvature of each plank to create the texture, and also a bit of cast shadow underneath the window frame and the doorknob. Next, I'm going to paint some moss to surround the entrance and fill in the gaps. I'm using a mix of permanent yellow deep with Prussian blue and burnt umber. For the lighter yellow green, it has a lot of permanent yellow deep in the ratio, whereas the darker green has more Prussian blue and burnt umber. And I like to alternate between these two colors. The lighter green will give the impression of moss, which are positioned at the top, and this catches more light, whereas the darker ones are positioned lower. So there are layers and levels to the moss. I want the moss to be a little bit overgrown so it's also interacting with the stairs. And I also want to give a bit more dimension to the stairs by darkening the front face of the stairs using a mix of burnt umber and Prussian blue. Since I've mixed up quite a bit here, I'm also going to use it to darken and separate the stones for the door frame. So it doesn't look too flat, I'm going to use a thinner consistency of the same color to color in some of the stones. I want the surface to look uneven, so I'm also leaving out some white negative space, and I'm just trying to make uneven brush strokes. And of course, going back and forth to a thicker consistency to fill in the gaps, so the gaps between the stones look uneven as well. Moving along to the exterior of the house, I'm adding the glow around the window with permanent yellow deep, and I soften the edges using a clean damp brush. Next, I'm going to paint lines as the texture for the mushroom stem or the exterior, and for this I'm using a light to medium consistency of burnt umber and vermilion. For the stem of the porcini mushrooms, I'm going to use the same color as what I used for the base of the main mushroom house, which is from buff titanium, burnt umber, and a little bit of Prussian blue. Right under the cap, I'm using a thicker consistency and a darker value which has more burnt umber and Prussian blue in the ratio. Here I'm using the same dark brown from the mushroom stem to paint underneath the window as a slight cast shadow from the frame. Next, let's paint the blueberries. For this, I'm using a light consistency of indigo just to paint the base evenly. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to go back to the first cluster and use a slightly thicker consistency to separate all of the blueberries. Then with a clean dry brush, I'm going to pick up the wet paint and spread it unevenly across all the blueberries. I like to go back and forth with the darker values as well to enhance the form of the berries, but as I try to make the texture, I always want to make sure that some of the light base color is still showing through, so it looks like the white texture of the blueberry skin. Now I'm going to go back to the first cluster, and as you can see, the colors have faded so much, so I'm using a thick consistency of indigo again to darken the sides and the bottom of the blueberries. And just like before, I use a clean, slightly damp brush to pull some of the paint and create the uneven texture of the skin. Once everything's completely dry, I want to add the bottom center of the berries. I'm going to add what somewhat looks like a star using a thick consistency of indigo, and if we can see it from the side, I'm going to make it growing out of the berries. Now let me go back to the roof of the mushroom house. I'm going to add the texture of the gills using a dry brush load or a really light brush load with the light brown mix from buff titanium, burnt umber, and Prussian blue. I'm just adding on lines following the curvature of the gill and directing it inwards. Then I'm going to separate the area of the cap, gills, and the ring of the mushroom with a dark brown. This has burnt umber, vermilion, and a bit of Prussian blue. For the ring, to darken it slightly, I also added some buff titanium and I used a light consistency. Now let's move on to the leaves of the blueberry plant. For this, I'm using permanent yellow deep and Prussian blue. You can mute down the color slightly to make it look more natural by adding a bit of burnt umber or a little bit of vermilion. I like to start with a light value and a light consistency mix for the base. Then I build it up using a darker value and a slightly thicker consistency for the midrib and the side of the leaves to make it look a little bit thicker and sturdier. You can play around with a variation of the green tone. As you can see, the leaves here at the top is a little bit more blue because it has more Prussian blue in the ratio. For the area behind these blueberry leaves, I'm just going to use a really dark color. So I just use a mix of burnt umber and Prussian blue with more Prussian blue in the ratio. I'm placing it in between the leaves and the blueberries, but I also left out a bit of negative space for the stem of the leaves. Next, let's paint the large fern. I'm going to use a lighter yellow green, so I'm adding more permanent yellow deep in the ratio this time. I kind of wished I added some vermilion though, so the color is more consistent in terms of the tonality. I only noticed once I finish everything, so this is something for you to think about if you decide to paint your own. To paint the fern, I like to start with the main stem, so it's much easier for me to paint on the leaves growing out from either side. I like to start from the very tip. As you can see, there's not much space in the curved area, so I only like to paint one side of the leaf, which is in the area of the curve facing inwards. Then as I get towards a larger area, I start to paint on larger leaves, which grows out of both sides. As I get towards the bottom, I enlarge or lengthen the leaves more. Then when it starts to get a little bit tricky painting the longer lengths, I paint the veins growing from either side of the main stem before painting on the curvy leaves growing on either side of the veins or the side stem. As for the smaller ferns, I'm using the same color. You can play around with the ratio. And just like before, I started by painting the curved stem. Then I paint the leaves growing out from the tip of the stem only on one side. Then once I have enough space, I paint the leaves on either side. I'm also going to do the same for this second one here. But this time, since I want to separate it from the one in front, I'm using a mix which has more Prussian blue, so the green is a bit darker. Now that I've painted all of the elements, I'm going to add a bit of a background. I decided to add some light yellow orbs. I feel like the round orbs complement the round mushroom house, and it also gives more of a magical feel to represent some bouquet dewdrops in the background. Be careful while you're doing this though. Remember to avoid painting on some of the white scales of the mushroom cap. Once I'm done, I'm going to take off the masking fluid to reveal the white areas that we can now paint. I'm starting with the window frames and I'm using burnt umber to paint the base so it looks earthy and natural. For the doorknob, I'm using a thick consistency of burnt umber and Prussian blue. Then while I still have this dark brown, I'm also going to use it to lift the frame and give it some form by painting the visible sides. For the windows, after painting on the frames, I feel like it lacks a bit of contrast. It looks too dark for my liking, so I decided to lighten it by using a mix of bleed-proof white and permanent yellow deep. For the white dots or the scales of the mushroom, I decided to paint it using a light gray from a mix of burnt umber and Prussian blue in a light consistency, and I'm placing this mostly at the bottom of the white scales to give it some volume. Then for more contrast, I'm using a light load on my brush and a thicker consistency to paint a thinner line at the bottom edge. Now I'm going to add some textures to the cap of the mushroom. I'm using vermilion and burnt umber in a light to medium consistency. I also want to add more vermilion around the sides of the mushroom cap, so there's more contrast to the glow of the window. Looking at the leaves of the blueberries, again, I feel like the colors are a little bit too faded, so I'm going to redefine it by adding the darker values again for the sides and the midrib. I'm also going to add a ground by using a mixture of buff titanium, a little bit of Prussian blue, and permanent yellow deep. Now I'm just going to outline everything and add a bit more texture to give the house a bit more character. Things like the gills, the texture of the stem and the ring, and things like that. I mentioned I used two colors for the outline, but they're quite similar actually. I think I just changed the two colors by accident. So you can just basically pick any dark brown that you have, or even something that's a little bit lighter than this if you want a softer outline. If you don't have colored pencils, you can also outline using an ink pen or just a normal pen in black or brown. I personally prefer brown because it gives a softer look overall. For the door, I'm going to add some wood grain, and I'm also going to darken by outlining the wooden panels since I didn't feel like the green was dark enough. For the mushroom caps, I'm going to add some subtle textures by adding curved lines following the cross contour. For this large one, I want the side of the cap to be slightly curved, especially under the window. So here I'm just helping enhance that curve by adding lines, especially in those areas. Under the ring of the mushroom, I like to thicken some of the line weight to help suggest darker values around the area. I also decided to darken the area under the gills to enhance the folds of the ring a bit more since the darker values look a bit too flat after adding the line textures. Once I'm happy with the outline, I'm going to add more texture with a medium consistency of bleed-proof white so it's not too white and it doesn't have too much contrast with what we've painted so far. I'm adding it around the large mushroom cap, the frame of the window, and some lines to help sharpen the edges of the blueberries. After this, I'm just going to add some finishing touches and final adjustments to fix certain areas, and that's basically it for this painting. Of course, for this painting, I'll have the outline available in my Ko-fi shop, and that's basically it. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification for more tutorials that I post every Friday. The list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!